All right, so what I wanted to talk about today is a particular issue that arises in Stoic philosophy. And I'll tell you why in just a moment, but just to give you a sort of heads up, it's what we call this in accordance with nature doctrine. And I think it's probably good if I give a very brief summary first about Stoicism, because I don't know that the intro students have had much about that. I know you classical philosophy students have. So Stoicism is one of the main schools in ancient philosophy. You've got Platonism in the Academy. Aristotle has his Lyceum. We have a few others. And the Stoics are named after a place called the Stoa, which is a porch, the Stoa Poikile, where this guy Zeno began teaching. And the handout that I have for you has sort of the successions of these Stoic philosophers. Like many of the ancient schools, you've got one person in charge, then another person following, and it went on for quite a while. Stoicism taught a number of doctrines that were systematically connected with each other. Among them were this notion that we talked about in the earlier class, the ethics class, about virtue being the only good, vice being the only bad, other things being external. Most of the things that are external are not really under our control, so we want to focus on what is in our control. But one of the other ideas that the Stoics kept talking about over and over and over again was this being in accordance with nature, or acting or living in accordance with nature. And recently, Stoicism has seen what you can describe, understating it, as an uptick in popularity. We're actually at the point in what we can call the modern Stoic movement, where we have an annual convention called Stoicon. I was just there in Toronto this year, providing a workshop and meeting with people, and we had about 400 people for that one. There are Stoicon X events that happen this year on 4 different continents. We have a online magazine, Stoicism Today, of which I'm the editor. And when it comes to social media, I think the Stoicism Facebook group is now past 35,000 members. So there's a lot of people very interested in it, and it's getting applied in businesses. It's getting applied in medical contexts and psychotherapeutic contexts. There's a lot of people talking about it. And one of the things that I noticed as somebody who does research on this is there's a lot of confusion about this in accordance with nature business. Come on in. Grab a handout too. And so I thought it could be useful, you notice me recording this, for a wider audience to talk a little bit about this. I actually wrote 2 pieces on this because I saw so much confusion in the Stoicism Facebook group, people saying, what is this? It means this, it means this. I was like, well, we probably should do some writing about that. And as I wrote those 2 pieces, by the time that I got to the end of them, I said, well, I think there's actually a short book here. So I'm at work right now. I took a detour from my other project, which is writing a book on Stoicism and anger. I put that on hold for the time being, and I'm currently writing a book on this question about what does in accordance with nature mean. Probably self-publish it so it can be done very affordably and get it out there much quicker. So this was an idea, living in accordance with nature, that was very central to the classic Stoics. And they continually developed it and expanded it. It seems to have some affinities and good, what we might call comparative possibilities with lots of other wisdom traditions, some of them philosophical, some of them religious, where there's this notion of aligning yourself with the world or the environment or with the nature of things. Because it's been causing so much controversy and confusion, it's something that's well worth talking about. So I wanted first to talk about, before we do a little bit of discussion, what we actually have about this doctrine in Stoic literature. So before going into that, I want to say one other thing too, which is that the majority of literature from classical Stoicism is lost. We have these wonderful catalogs of books in a source called Diogenes Laertius' Lives of the Philosophers. We've got almost none of those books. Not just for the Stoics, even for people like Aristotle. Aristotle wrote all these interesting sort of case studies of constitutions. We've got one of them. He wrote about 143, I think. We've got one. When it comes to Stoic literature, I would estimate that we actually talked about this at Stoicon. We probably possess anywhere from 3 to 10% of what was originally written in the ancient world. All the rest of it is gone. So what we do have is helpful, but it's not necessarily the full picture. We do know that the founder of Stoicism, Zeno, wrote a book specifically called On Life According to Nature. We may discover a manuscript of that someday. I'm not going to hold my breath waiting for it. It would be wonderful if we could read it, but it's gone. And we don't even have any useful excerpts from it. We know that he wrote another book called On Choice or On Human Nature. That would have been nice to have as well, but we don't have it. So we have to reconstruct it from other sources. And the main sources that we have for it fall in two different classes. So a little bit of sort of intellectual history here. We have a few works by what we call late Stoics. These are people in the later period of Stoicism living within the Roman Empire. And there's really three main people. Seneca, who we have a lot of stuff from. We have his letters. We have a number of works that he's written. Actually, that's the bulk of the Stoic literature that we have. Epictetus, who probably in some respects more important than Seneca. We only have two things, and they weren't actually written by him. They were written by his student, who was a historian, Arius. We have his discourses, and then we have his Enchiridion, which some of you may have encountered. The Enchiridion is actually a set of excerpts from the discourses. And we believe that we've lost half of the discourses. We think there were 8 books originally. And then we have this book that's originally entitled To Myself by a Roman emperor, Marcus Aurelius, who's coming a little bit later. And it's nice. It's got 12 books or chapters in it. It's not very organized, but really not much of the Stoic literature is. And it's helpful because it talks about this. But much of the time, these guys are actually, instead of explaining the doctrine, they're referring to it and using it. They're not going into a lot of detailed explanations systematically about it because it's the sort of thing, well, everybody knows. They had access to all those books that we've lost. So why reinvent the wheel? There, as a side note, there actually was one Stoic writer who was faulted for doing that, the third scholar, Chrysippus, who was one of the most prolific authors of antiquity. He wrote a lot of stuff, but people were like, it's mostly excerpts and explanations of other people's things. So we've got those guys, right? And we have a few other supplemental texts that are kind of nice. There's some fragments from a guy called Heracles. They found these, in the 1800s. They managed to damage a lot of the scrolls. Now we're slowly getting to look at the ones that they didn't completely destroy. And then we have other literature. And I actually brought one of these with us. Before I talk about this one, I'll mention, I brought up Diogenes Laertius. Diogenes Laertius was a historian of philosophy. And he's not really original. He's not particularly brilliant. But it's actually better that he wasn't, because he just sort of sticks to what the people actually said, as far as we can tell. And in his 7th book of the Lives of the Philosophers, we get the Life of Zeno, which contains a whole discussion of what it is that the Stoics think, what it is that they taught. So it's like a summary, sort of like a Cliff Notes of what the ancient Stoics had to say. Another really important source is another person who's not a Stoic. Diogenes was not a Stoic, and that's Cicero, who you may have heard of. Marcus Tullius Cicero. Very important Roman politician, took part in the Civil War, sided with Pompey against Caesar, so he picked the losing side. Thought that Caesar was a terrible guy. I'm actually kind of convinced by his reasons. And Cicero wrote a lot of books. He was taking Greek philosophy and putting it into a Latin language, an idiom, And we get a lot of Stoic literature through Cicero, even though he himself is not a Stoic. He's attracted to it in certain respects. And then the third one that's particularly nice is this Arius Didymus epitome of Stoic ethics, right? And this is a nice text where you've got the Greek on one side and the Latin on the other. This is actually probably written around the time of Augustus, so after Julius Caesar, because Arius Didymus is thought to have been a friend of Augustus, but it shows up in a much later manuscript called this manuscript by Johannes Stobaeus, who was actually taking a lot of philosophical texts during the beginning of the Dark Ages and compiling them for his son's education. And this made it in, and this is another sort of summary of Stoic ideas. So we've got two different sets of texts. We have the late Stoics, who for the most part aren't really explaining the doctrine that much. They're referring to it all the time, and this is why people reading them are like, what's this in accordance with nature business? I'm not sure I understand it. And then we have the explanations, which are for the most part by people who aren't Stoics. And that's what we've got to work with. So I've talked at you quite a bit at this point. Let's talk about this business of nature. So when you hear the words living in accordance with nature, what would that mean to you? Forget the Stoics. What do we mean by nature today? Or living in accordance with it? Yeah.
Human nature?
Okay, so what is human nature like?
It's a bit crude, I guess.
Go ahead.
I guess, I don't know. Human nature, what's human nature like?
Well, sometimes when people do bad stuff, we say, oh, that's just human nature, know? And we're like, well, these politicians took bribes. I mean, we're here in Illinois, where you guys have some real challenges. I'm from Wisconsin, where things are a little bit less corrupt, and the state's a little bit more functional. And we might, why are things so human nature? People are schmucks, right? Well, that's not what the Stoics actually mean, but that is a way in which we use the term today, right? But what else do we mean by nature? I mean, I'm looking out the window and seeing some of the fall foliage. That's the natural world, right? Is it possible to live in accordance with that? What would that mean? What does that look like? Do you make yourself like a mud hut, maybe, and weave all your clothes out of bark, or wool that comes from the sheep that you live with? Is that more in accordance with nature? And when we use this term all the time, this is all natural. What do we mean by that when we're talking about like food stuff? Yeah.
It hasn't been affected at all.
Okay, so it hasn't been processed much, or we might distinguish between genetic modification of things, and then this is non-GMO food. I mean, most all natural food has been processed in one way or another. If you're eating oatmeal, oats doesn't come right off of the oat plant the way you get it in the box or in your little package, right?
Doesn't?
Well, unless you plant one of those oat trees,
Oat trees.
The Quaker ones, where you just pull the packet off with it. I mean, what do we mean? If we say you should live in accordance with nature, this is the puzzle that a lot of people in these Stoic forums are winding up with, because they see Epictetus saying, hey, you should keep your will or your faculty of choice in accordance with nature. And they're like, oh yeah, accordance with nature, that sounds good. Now what is that exactly? And they get into big fights about this. What else might we mean? Yeah.
Well, it could refer to sort of a higher sense of divine nature and living in accordance with the will of divinity.
Okay. And the Stoics do talk quite a bit about that. Well, I'm going to reserve that one for a moment. I want to come back to this natural world. How do we live in accordance with it? Yeah. Or okay.
I take it as kind of like living a balance, like using only what you need, not using like excess materials. But not only that, but like making time to go outside and to, like go and like take in nature.
Appreciate it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Not, for example, in summer, maybe you don't need the air conditioning on all the time. That could be living in accordance with nature. We don't have to turn the heat on right now because it's not really that cold. We can put on a sweater. Okay. Anybody else have any other ideas? So, one thing I want to point out, notice that there's a lot of different meanings that we might assign to nature. And if we're not careful in distinguishing these, we're going to blur them all together. And that's typically, not just with this issue, but a lot of other issues, how we get into intractable arguments with each other. Like, everybody's for freedom, right? Is anybody against freedom in here? No? What does freedom mean? Well, there's a whole bunch of different meanings of freedom. And if I talk about freedom, I might not have the same thing in mind that you do. So we want to look, when it comes to the Stoics, at what they mean by what's in accordance with nature. Because they get criticized a lot by people who are like, these Stoics, they talk about this living in accordance with nature, but that means that you should behave this way. Because I know exactly what nature means. Nietzsche criticizes the Stoics for that sort of thing. He says they're a bunch of frauds. People who are into evolutionary biology and think that there are hardwired distinctions between the male brain and the female brain will try to read that into Stoicism. And the Stoics actually say that's not the case at all. They think that men and women have to cultivate the same virtues and have the same capacities. So if we have the wrong conception of nature, and I don't mean wrong in the sense of factually incorrect, but just not mapping onto what the Stoics are talking about, we're going to get very mixed up when we look at them. So we probably want to see what they actually have to say. So one of the things that we should keep in mind is the Stoics actually had sort of a development of their doctrine. And I've given you, that's why I have the handout here. You can sort of peg where these people fit in. Zeno was the first person, apparently, to talk about the end of human life as life in agreement with nature, which he says is the same as a virtuous life, a life of the virtues, a life cultivating good moral qualities, virtue being the goal towards which nature guides us. Now, this sounds quite a bit different than looking at just the outside world or thinking about human nature as being we're a bunch of terrible people. The idea is that human beings, we have certain capacities for these types of moral goodness, distinctive types that we'll talk about in a moment. There's some development in the doctrine. This is again Diogenes Laertes telling us. He says, by the nature which our life ought to be in accord, Chrysippus, third guy in there, understands both the common nature of the universe and the specific nature of the human being, whereas Cleanthes, second guy in there, takes the nature of the universe alone as that which should be followed without adding the nature of the part of the universe. So if we don't worry about the divine so much, but we think about the cosmos that we live in, the Stoics early on thought that we could adapt ourselves to it. We could look at it, we could figure out how it works, and we could say, this is the right way to live in accordance with it. This is a way that's out of whack with nature, or to use their terminology, since there's no out of whack in ancient texts, contrary to nature. There's some additional developments that Arius Didymus talks about, when he says, Zeno interpreted the goal to live in agreement, that is, to live according to a single line of reason and in harmony, as those who live in conflict are unhappy. So when we think about our lives and where we're unhappy and the conflicts that we get in with other people, they usually stem from conflicts within ourselves, and we want to work through those conflicts. Those after him, Didymus says, adding further detail, expressed it like this: to live in agreement with nature, assuming Zeno's statement was insufficient. So Cleanthes added with nature and interpreted it. The goal is living in agreement with nature. Chrysippus said to live in accord with the experience of what happens naturally. Diogenes, the fourth guy, to be circumspect in the selection and rejection of things in accord with nature. Now it's getting more and more complicated, right? And finally we get to Antipater, who says to live continually selecting what is in accordance with nature and rejecting what is contrary to nature. And that's all very nice, but it still doesn't tell us exactly what living in accordance with nature is. The other thing I want to say before we look at it a little bit more closely is the Stoics, they use a wide vocabulary for this, a lot of synonyms. Sometimes it's in agreement, homologous, the word that we get homology from in mathematics, in agreement in that way. Sometimes it's another way of expressing it, katafusin, which means along the lines of nature. They also talk about following nature, literally like following along, participating in nature. These are just the Greek terms. The Latin writers use yet other terms. So let's talk about living in accordance with the whole. Since we made this distinction, the totality of nature and human nature. The Stoics, although they did recognize the divine, they didn't think of the divine as something outside of the world. They believed that the world itself was divine, or at least the reason running throughout it, the logos running throughout the world. And so this entire physical world that we're part of has its processes, and we can live in accordance with it, or we can be sort of, you might say, against it. Now, we can't really escape those processes. But what they mean is instead, the way that we orient our thoughts and our feelings and our choices and actions. So, if I try to do things that are actually against the way the physical world works, I can try it, it's not going to succeed, right? If I decide that this should turn into a cookie for me, and I just really concentrate on it, because I want to have a cookie after lunch, that's not going to happen, right? And if I invest, my emotions in wanting a cookie, and this is the way I'm going to get a cookie rather than like walking to the cafeteria and buying a cookie, I'm going to be unhappy. Better to recognize this as what it is. It's good for my glasses, and that's about it, and the cookie will happen later on its own terms. There's a whole set of physical processes by which I get a cookie. And this is a silly example that I just made up here, but you see how that works. So the Stoics, if we want to talk about it in sort of bigger picture themes, they talk about accepting fate. That's part of what it means to live in accordance with nature as this totality. Accepting the situations that we're given. Doesn't mean that we're totally passive, but we don't expect them to be other than they are. Some of these are, you might say, common sense, right? We're close to winter now. If I go walking around, tonight dressed like this, what's going to happen to me? Pretty cold, yeah. Even today without the sweater, it's kind of cold. For me to expect things to be different than that is irrational. What's rational is to learn how nature actually works and then try to align myself with it. So this is physical processes, and a lot of this is stuff that we don't really think about until we get into situations that bother us. So for example, living in accordance with nature would mean recognizing the vulnerability of things that we're fond of to natural processes. So, this can, what can go wrong with this? It can tear. I'm not going to tear it because I need this thing. There's all sorts of things, natural processes that can go wrong with this. Anyone ever dropped one of these into a sink or a bathtub or a toilet? What happens?
Bad things.
Yeah, and you know what? Apple even knows. People will go and they'll say, I don't know what happened to. They try the rice thing, put it in a dry rice, and that'll suck the. It doesn't actually work. They go to the Apple store and they're like, my phone just stopped working, and the Apple guys are like, there's actually a switch in here that flips when it gets wet, so we know you dropped it in something. We're not paying for it, right? Well, that's just natural processes. The same thing can apply to people that we care about. Epictetus says something very, very, that a lot of people view as very, very harsh. He says, when you kiss your spouse or child, remind yourself that they are something mortal. And then when they die, you're not going to be so upset. And people are like, whoa, that's pretty harsh. You probably don't care about your wife or kid. He starts out the sentence by saying, with those who you care about, this is what you ought to do. So to adapt ourselves to nature means to accept things the way they really are and to go with that. Seneca has this wonderful line. He says that nature wishes our laws to be identical with her own. We would live in a way that is adapted to how things really are. He also says the Stoics also say that there's laws to, you might say, the ways our minds work. If we choose certain things, other things will follow. And a lot of people get themselves in trouble by wanting to choose certain things that are going to lead to other things and saying, no, I didn't actually choose this other thing. So what would be a common example of that? Well, if you want people to enjoy your company, you can't be grouchy with them, right? Unless you find somebody who likes grouchiness. So if you want to be grouchy all the time, then don't expect people to like you. To expect people to like you and want to be grouchy all the time is irrational. This is a very common example of living out of accord with nature. So one of the ways that Diogenes explains this, he says, living virtuously is equivalent to living in accordance with experience of the actual course of nature. Our individual natures are parts of the nature of the whole universe. This is why the end may be defined as life in accordance with nature or in accordance with our own human nature as well as that of the universe. So let's talk about human nature. We mentioned that a lot of times we say, oh, that's just human nature when people do things that are bad, right? That's not what the Stoics actually mean. The Stoics think that we have the potentiality as rational creatures, as something different than the other animals, to live a better life. And so to live in accordance with nature is something that we're probably not all doing. Even those who are studying or practicing Stoicism are not doing entirely. Because if you did, you'd be what the Stoics call the sage, the wise person, who's fully developed. We're more in process. So we decide where we're going to orient ourselves. Are we making progress? Or are we backsliding and falling more towards other things? So we could think of this as a kind of transcendence or transformation of our nature towards something better. And the Stoics begin a lot of their discussions of this by talking about what it is that we have in common with other animals. So what is it that all animal life tries to do in your experience? Yeah.
Multiply.
That's one thing. That's a little bit higher. They try to reproduce. But you're totally right about that. And along with that comes, for certain animals, not just making little versions of themselves, right? Maybe they make eggs and the eggs hatch or something like that. But they have some way of taking care of their young. Even like the wasp who stings the spider, lays all of her eggs inside the spider, and then takes off and dies, has provided for their young, right? That's why some do this with caterpillars. Wasps are kind of predatory creatures in many respects. We do this by raising our kids, hopefully, right? Other animals do this too, in different ways. What's even lower than that, though? More basic. In order to reproduce, there's something else you have to do as a precondition.
Survive.
Stay alive. Yeah, every animal attempts to preserve its own self. And not just that, but to flourish, to do the things that are going to make it have a fuller life, to be healthy, and to try to avoid the things that are going to injure you. This extends even to like your sense of taste. Sweet things in general. You shouldn't eat too many of them because we live in a situation of artificial abundance. But sweet things in general are wholesome to eat. Bitter things, generally, don't eat them. Nature designed us in such a way as to be able to tell at least some of the time what's going to kill us and what's going to benefit us. Now, what does human nature add on top of that? The Stoics say we're rational beings. Rational means we do problem solving, we communicate with each other, we develop technology, but it also means that we live in society with each other in ways that animals don't. I mean, some animals live in packs, or bees live in hives and things like that. But the beehives never actually get together and like work out the problems with their neighbors. They just, if they have another beehive that's a problem, they sting them all or do something. Ants are really interesting to observe in this respect because they like colonize each other and some enslave each other and steal each other's young and do all sorts of weird stuff. But it's all basically like chemical programming for them. For us, our rational nature, if we fully develop it, it means we can live in harmony with each other. That's a big challenge, though. And the Stoics spent a lot of time talking about how that might come about. If we don't do that, we descend to the level of mere animals. Epictetus has a lot of wonderful metaphors about us. If we just follow our baser sexual and appetite instincts, eating food, we're like sheep then. That's basically what a sheep's great life, getting to eat when it wants to, not getting eaten by the wolf, and getting to reproduce. Wonderful life. Or if we're predatory towards each other, if we attack each other, we're more like the beasts of prey, like the wolf or the cunning fox or the lion, or Epictetus likes also the snake and the wasp who pesters other people. And we don't want to do that. The Stoics stress that every human being can live and act in accordance with nature, at least to some degree, by developing our own human nature. This is going to require a lot of other stuff along the way, like developing the virtues, justice, temperance, courage, and wisdom. It's going to develop recognizing what our duties to other people are and fulfilling those duties. It's going to require working on ourselves, recognizing where we're not doing as well as we should and where we should work on ourselves more. They also have some very specific injunctions or interpretations of this. So, for example, Musonius Rufus, Epictetus' teacher, thought that farming was probably the way of life that was most in accordance with nature. Now, he was living in an agricultural society, but maybe there's something to that. Do we think that farmers are more connected with the natural world than the rest of us living in a very technological society? Do any of you garden? You're probably not all farming, right? But when you garden, you actually get your hands in the soil. You get to know something about plants and also hopefully about animals as well. Musonius Rufus also talked about marriage. He thought that was something in accordance with nature. A lot of these things are kind of culturally bound in the late Stoics. So Epictetus, for example, says something that we probably won't agree with now. He was very rigid about gender roles. Men should dress like men and look like men. Women should dress like women and look like women. That's in accordance with nature. I think now we'd probably be a bit more relaxed about that. He even went to the extent of facial hair. I'd be a good guy because I have a beard. You are clearly out of accord with nature because you're shaving. You too. You've got a little bit. Yeah. You'd be okay, although your beard is kind of short, So, some of this we probably want to say that's culturally bound. We're going to reject that. But, there's other parts that we might want to think about. Seneca and Cicero will tell us, for example, that anger, the Stoics took a very hard line on anger. They said anger is never in accordance with nature. It could be something natural that we feel, but it's not actually in accordance with a fully developed human nature. Epictetus has another really interesting conversation with a father where he talks to this guy, and the guy came to visit him, and Epictetus is like, "How's married life going with you?" And he said, "Oh, it's terrible, I've got this daughter, and she got sick, and I was so overcome by my affection for her that I had to leave." And Epictetus says, "That's kind of weird. Wait a second. So you love her so much that when she got sick, you couldn't stay there?" And the guy says, "Yeah, that's the way, that's the way I felt naturally. That's what fathers do. This is perfectly natural." And Epictetus says, let's think about this a bit. you certainly did something that you think is natural, but it's not something good, and I don't think you made her situation any better by taking off when she is sick, and she could die, right? The guy's worried about her dying, he's feeling anxiety. And then Epictetus, like the clincher, as he says, what did her mom do? Did her mom take off too? What about the nurse? Did her nurse take off? I think they love her, don't they? And then the absolute knockout blow is, what if you were sick? Would you want people to like say, oh, I have so much natural affection for you that I'm not going to stick around and take care of you? And the guy, realizes that he's wrong about this. Developing this sort of natural, familial affection or affection towards friends or stuff like that, that would be within the scope of human nature as well. And so the Stoics are good for showing us these sorts of things. They also talk about using appearances, using the way things appear to us when impinges on us in accordance with nature or against nature. So what would be an example of this? Well, I mentioned anger is a serious issue for the Stoics. When somebody cuts you off in traffic, does that tick you off? It ticks me off. And I think that person is a jerk. And sometimes I'm even, I don't follow the impulse anymore, but I have the impulse that I should go around and cut them off too. And then maybe give them the finger when I do that. Or honk my horn, which is very risky behavior. Really stupid, And why the hell would I think that makes sense? Right?
You're human.
I'm human.
Human nature.
Yeah, well, it's not really human nature. It's a damaged human nature. It's an undeveloped human nature, or less developed human nature, let's say. If I look at what's going on there, and I start practicing this, like when I get an impression that somebody cut me off because they, want to stick it to me, and I should act in this way, I can actually take a pause and say, no, maybe I'm going to suspend my judgment here. Maybe I'm not going to go along with that. That's to use appearances in accordance with nature. We can use external things in accordance with nature, or out of accord with nature. We can use our wealth. We can use our social position. We can use our bodies. Arius Didymus, gives all sorts of examples of this, going to household management that are kind of interesting. I mentioned the natural affection and how that should work according to Epictetus. And Epictetus is a really interesting guy because he introduces another wrinkle. Unlike the other Stoics, Epictetus focuses very heavily on what we have as a Greek term, proairesis. In some of your translations, it'll be translated as will or volition. In other cases, it's faculty of choice. In other cases, it's moral purpose. In some translations, it changes from passage to passage, which makes it a little hard to track. But what it is the core of who you are. Epictetus tells people at a certain point, you are not your body, you are not your wealth, you are your faculty of choice. You are what you've made of yourself. And he constantly stresses the need to either harmonize or bring in accordance or act in accordance, to choose to make this part of who we are, the ruling part, in accordance with nature. And he thinks that when we start out, we're not in accordance with nature. We're usually beset by all sorts of problems and issues. So to bring this to a close, and I'm going to open this up for questions and comments in just a second, I want to come back to the modern Stoics and the controversy and confusions about this. So in the modern Stoic community, there are some people who will chime in, often on Facebook, and say, this term is just too vague. I don't know what it means to be in accordance with nature. Does that mean like I have to study physics or biology or adopt what the latest thing is from evolutionary theory to make sense of this? So some people are confused for that reason. Other people are importing ideas of nature that don't map onto what the Stoics mean. Others within the community are saying, there's a lot of cool stuff about Stoicism, but we don't have to keep all the stuff from the past. I mean, there's a lot of things in what we call the Stoic physics that we don't buy for a second, like that, the whole world is ruled by some cosmic mind that takes the form of fire, and all that. We don't do that sort of stuff anymore. So maybe this whole in accordance with nature thing is not very helpful. We'll get rid of it. Others are saying, that it just means living rationally. So every time that we see living in accordance with nature, we can just substitute living rationally, and we're good. My answer is quite simply to say, we know what the Stoics mean by living in accordance with nature. It's in their actual texts. So if we go to those texts and figure out what they actually mean by it, then we can decide whether we want to keep the idea or not. But that should be the place where we begin, with a proper understanding of what they actually said. And so there's a lot of interesting controversy. This is an ongoing topic, a live issue in a community of people worldwide who are arguing with each other about that. That's not something you can say about everything you're studying in ancient philosophy, I think, right? So I thought this might be of some interest. Now we've got some time for Q&A, about 8 minutes before I have to let you guys go. Or comments, suggestions, confusions, whatever it is that you'd like to bring up. Yeah.
You said something about sages. Are there any of the people that have reached that level in our modern time or no?
Oh, well, this is a big question, right? And the ancient Stoics, some of them were yeah, there were some sages, Socrates was a sage, but nobody ever wants to claim to be a sage, because if you do, of course, you're not being humble. And there's a question still going on now. Well, who are the sages? And so I don't know anyone who claims to be one. I interact pretty regularly with people who are kind of heavy hitters within the modern Stoic community, and although I would definitely say that there are some of them who are way further along the line than I am, they're not sages. They have foibles and things like that. But you might think of it more like an ideal to approximate to, And this is a really interesting point. Cicero, again, who's not a Stoic, he talks about this a lot in terms of people who are virtuous. We shouldn't always refer to these super high levels that nobody ever achieves. Instead, let's think about people that we know who actually seem further along than us, but aren't completely perfect, because at least then we've got real models that we can look to. That's probably more helpful. If you've got a grandpa who you're Grandpa's a pretty good guy. I mean, every once in a while he says an off-color remark, and I don't know why you got in a fight with this guy over here, but for the most part, he seems like somebody worth emulating. That would be second best sage almost, right? But what the sage would be doing is offering us a picture of what it really means to be a person aligned with nature.
I see a Stoic video game where Sage is the highest level.
Or the sage is the boss who you've got to beat.
Yeah, it's you only attain there when you're not disturbed when your daughter dies or something. I don't know what it would be.
I don't know how you could make Stoicism into an interesting video game.
Well, that was a joke, but how only after, because that was my question. So is the Stoic sage they won't cry when their daughter dies? You know what I mean? I think that's people's skepticism about Stoicism.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, it's interesting, because on that issue, I think a lot of people confuse having an emotional reaction with caring.
Mm-hmm.
You can care without being the prey of your emotions. You can recognize that it sucks that you've lost somebody who's close to you and they lost their life without it tearing you to pieces. Again, I'll bring up Cicero, because this is one place where Cicero he likes the Stoics for a lot of things. In a book called the Tusculan Disputations, where he's considering their whole moral theory, he says the Stoics, I think, didn't get this quite right. And Cicero's talking as a father who did lose a daughter, who lost a daughter who he was very, very close to, and who, writing philosophy, is actually a consolation for him, a way of him to get over the loss of his daughter. So I think what Cicero says is, we can mourn, but in the appropriate ways. So maybe that's what we have to do. I don't go along with the Stoics on the anger thing either. I think there are some cases where we probably should get angry. If I see my kid getting bullied, anger might spur me to do the right thing. The Stoics did think that it was bad across the board, though.
Mhm.
So I think modern Stoics accept some things and then reject other things. It's not a lockstep, every single thing, because it's in the Stoic text, we must follow it, word by word, yeah.
So I'm confused. They wouldn't be emotional because it was irrational for them to die.
Well, it was rational. I mean, if your kid gets sick, it's not rational like the kid actually makes a decision and says,
I know, but
reason,
they're mortal, so
Yeah.
obviously they will die at some point, so they're not emotional, even though they're...
Well, they may be
attached to-
emotional. I mean, the issue is how are the emotions excessive? Stoics are not unemotional. They think that some emotions are actually good. We should feel affection towards our children, for example. But that doesn't mean that we have to be overcome by grief if they die. That doesn't. The fact of being overcome by grief, that's not the test of whether you care for them or not. That's what the Stoics would say.
There's that, you mentioned at the beginning, so like in Epictetus in particular, but other places too, there's that one particular passage that's kind of a sticking point.
Oh, yeah,
where
yeah.
it basically suggests...
When I first read that, I was like, "This is terrible."
Yeah. Like the true person wouldn't cry even if his own family member died or something like that. And then he goes on to say, however, if he expresses, he kind of says what you started to say there too, that it's the show of the correct kind of emotion or something. But
he says two other things. He says if your neighbor has lost their kid, don't hesitate to grieve with them. Just don't grieve inwardly. So it's not like you go to it's not like going to the funeral. You wouldn't go through the reception line and say, "Not a great loss to you." That would be totally callous.
Well, it depends on the death, but yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And then at another point, he also says, so like when your neighbor is all upset about something, you're able to say, that's the course of things. That's the way things go. Now, when you apply that to yourself, it's not quite so easy, right? So this is really a cognitive strategy for dealing with the emotions in a way that's not going to result in being so unhappy. But again, it's approximative. I don't know a lot of people who are practicing Stoicism who never grieve, never get angry, never feel anxiety, but they certainly feel less. So that's nice.
Yeah.
How much time? Oh, we have time for one more question. We have 1 minute left. Anybody?
Or time to thank our guest, everybody.
Oh, that'll work too.
Thanks, Professor, to